Hello there, and welcome to Cardboard and Plastic, a channel devoted to miniature painting and board game reviews. I'm Dylan, and today is going to be a miniature painting tutorial for Vast, the Crystal Caverns, starting with the Knight. This video tutorial is intended for beginners, but I do like to try in every miniature that I do paint to challenge myself in some sort of way, so there may be some techniques here that you aren't comfortable with, but for the most part I didn't do anything too crazy with this miniature. Of course, if there's any part of this tutorial that you get to and you have trouble with, or you don't want to attempt to try it, then of course you can always just skip it. Keep in mind, some of these things that I do is just suggestions. For the Knight figure here, I'm sticking pretty close to the artwork, but of course things like skin tone or the uniform color, you could always change however you wish the mini to look. Alright, let's jump into painting the miniature. The first thing we do is throw on a coat or two of primer. Primer gives us a surface to basically put our miniature paint on so that it will stick to the miniature. If you just paint straight onto the plastic, you're going to have trouble usually with the paint actually staying on. I like to use zenithal priming for a lot of my figures. This is basically to give us sort of the impression of where the light and dark areas of a figure are, pretending that the sun, which is going to be our white spray, is at its zenith. I use Citadel primer for this particular mini. I do use Army Painter occasionally. It kind of just depends on what my local game store has on in stock. So for now I'm stuck with Citadel. But anyways, I used black to do a nice first coat and then spraying from just slightly above white primer. I like to start with the hard to reach areas, and this is largely because if you're using the easy to reach areas, it's sometimes pretty easy to go straight over those hard to reach places, or vice versa. I'm starting with the skin. Now I'm going to be doing sort of an advanced skin tone technique here that I've learned. And if you would like to try it and follow along, go right ahead. If there's a different skin tone that you want to go with, or just a different technique in general, feel free to use that instead. I'll talk a bit more about the skin technique that I'm using when we actually go into the highlighting stage of the figure. For now, I'm just using Vallejo medium flesh tone to cover that skin. Most of the visible skin is going to be on her face. I'm trying to avoid the eye sockets and the mouth as much as possible, but I'm not too worried if I do spill over into those areas. Also, the hand holding the shield has some visible skin. You can determine if the skin through the slits of the handle of the shield is actually worth painting or not. You could use that to also be the shirt color. And there's also a small division between where her fingers are and sort of the gloves or the shirt that she's wearing on her right hand. Keep in mind that I keep all of my paints thinned with a drop or two of water. This also means that every area that I paint, I'm probably going to be going over with about 2 or 3 layers of paint to get a nice solid base coat. Next up is the hair itself. I'm using Army Painter's Babe Blonde. The particular bottle I have is from their Zombicide paint set, but of course in stores it's under the same name. The bottle will just look slightly different. This is a really bright yellow, but I really like it to match sort of the artwork. This color I'm keeping pretty thin, so you can see some of that zenithal highlighting just a little bit through what I'm doing. I'm not too worried about keeping the zenithal highlighting purely, because I'm actually going to highlight the hair up pretty bright. I'm not going to show every mistake correction that I do here, but you will notice that I probably missed a slight bit of hair on her left shoulder. This is because as I was painting it, I thought that might be a piece of her armor for some reason, and later I was like, oh, that's actually hair. So I just went back and painted over it. Any mistakes like that, just feel free to correct them as you do them, or as you notice them. Next up, I'm going to start painting her uniform. I'm going to start with Japanese Uniform World War II from Vallejo. Her uniform is sort of an alternating color pattern, so I'm starting on the left side, and then the bottom right, and then the final bottom left with this color. As for the other parts of the uniform, I'm going to be using Averland Sunset from Citadel. The shield itself will actually use the exact same colors. For the wooden part of the shield, I'm going to be using that Japanese World War II uniform color. And for the dragon symbol in the middle of the shield, Averland Sunset. As for the strap running across her shoulder and the belt, I'm going over this with an initial coat of German Grey from Vallejo. I'm also using this for the necklace. Next up, I'm going to tackle both of the bedrolls, the one on top of her backpack, and then of course at the bottom holding her sword. This is going to be done in orange brown from Vallejo. Next up, I'm going to tackle the backpack with some Steel Legion Drab. For the straps on the back of the shield, I use Steel Legion Drab. Next up, I decided to tackle the shirt, which I use Rust Grey from Citadel. Now there is a point of contention here. There is sort of a gauntlet shape on her right hand. If you look at the artwork, on some of the artwork, she appears to have sort of a leather gauntlet there to protect her when she uses her bow, and on others it looks like it's sort of a blue piece of fabric as well. I decided to keep it the bluish color, but if you would prefer it be a leather gauntlet or something, you could just use Steel Legion Drab here to differentiate that. Next up, I'm going to tackle all these silvery bits. So I'm using Shining Silver from Army Painter, and I'm going to hit the boots with this, her shoulder pads, the elbow pads. I'm also hitting the zipper on the backpack with this Shining Silver. Next up, I'm tackling the rope hanging around her backpack, and I did this with Screaming Skull. Now technically these are hard to reach areas, so doing these after doing the backpack is maybe a little weird. I largely decided to do this just because it is a light color, so painting over Steel Legion Drab on any mistakes that happen to hit onto the backpack is pretty easy to do. I'm tackling the twine holding up the bedrolls, and I use German Grey for this. As for the swords themselves, there's two different swords. The one that she's holding is a gold-handled sword. I took bright gold and mixed it with just a smidge of Flash Glitch Yellow from Citadel, just to tone down the gold tone a little bit, and I used that for the hilt of the sword. Now I decided to jump back to the front of the figure, and I'm painting the little jewels in her belt and on her necklace in Ulthuan Grey. The reason I'm doing this is largely just because it's kind of a pain to paint a metallic color straight onto black. It just takes a lot of coats and things. So I want sort of an intermediate color here that's light in tone, just so that I can paint my gold right on top of it and not have to do an excessive amount of layers. Now I'm going over the jewels on the belt and their necklace with the Flash Glitz gold mix. Next up, I'm starting on her cape. I mixed that orange brown with a little bit of ivory to give it sort of a lighter cream color. You will notice on one side of my figure there is an extremely large gap where the cape seems to have kind of not been sealed properly. I will repair this at a later stage, so for now, don't worry about it. I am now finally finishing off the swords. For the sword blades themselves, Shining Silver. For the hilt and the very tip of the second sword, around her back, I'm going to use that shining silver as well. For the actual hilt of the sword, I'm using orange brown. And just before we finish the base coat, I noticed that I missed the little metal nubs of the straps on the back of the shield. I just hit those with shining silver. And that does it for the base colors. Now yes, she has black soulless eyes and a black soulless mouth right now, but that will be fixed when we get to the final highlighting stage. For now, I'm going to be using a series of washes to darken certain areas or just bring out a level of contrast across the figure. I'm going to be doing the washes largely in the same series of stages that we did the base paints, but slightly different here and there. My first wash is going to be the skin, and I'm using Seraphim Sepia for this. Next up, I will use Cassandora Yellow. I'm going to use this for the hair, the uniform, the gold bits, the gold hilt on the sword, and her cape. The shield itself will also receive one coat of Cassandora Yellow. Nuln oil for the sword blades and the metal bits. I'm going to use Drakenhof Nightshade for the shirt. And Agrax Earthshade is going to be used basically for the bedrolls, the backpack, right before we finish though, I am going to darken the shield just slightly. This is completely optional, but it's to make the wood look a little bit more like wood and differentiate it from the uniform that she's wearing. I'm going to make my own wash using Vallejo Smoke. With one brush load of smoke, I'm going to take about 50% water there and water it down. This will have an effect of sort of darkening and pointing out those dark grooves in the wood itself. On most figures, I would actually do a second wash of this, and this is up to you if you want to do it, to get an even darker wood color. But since Vast is sort of a colorful game, I like to keep it semi-bright. And with that, our series of washes is complete. Our next and final part is the highlighting stage. This is typically going to be the longest amount of time spent on any sort of miniature. And of course, you can always choose to do less time if you want, or even to choose to not to do it at all. For the most part, this miniature looks pretty good as is. Really, you would only need to fix up the eyes and the mouth, and you could call it complete. Of course, if you want to bring her to the next level and make her stand out just a little bit more, then you would want to do this stage. I'm going to be approaching these highlights kind of in really no particular order, just kind of the easiest at the moment. So for highlighting, essentially what you're doing here is creating a series of gradients. And this is a lot easier said than it really is done, especially if you had no formal art training. Now, gradients I am no master of, and it still takes me some time sometimes to get them right. Our wash does a good job of darkening just slightly that medium flesh tone that we really don't need to go over it and create any sort of new skin tone using our base color. Instead, I'm going to jump straight into Kislev Flesh. Now, Kislev Flesh I'm going to use for most of the skin. I'm really only trying to keep sort of the gaps between maybe the fingers, the darkest recesses of her cheek, under her chin, really just the really dark areas I'm going to keep medium flesh tone. Everything else I'm kind of keeping with Kislev Flesh. And then I'm going to Flayed One's Flesh. I'm really picking out sort of the brightest areas I really want to stay the really light color. For me, that area is going to be the tops of the forehead, the tips of the nose, tips of her chin, the tips of her mouth. Those sort of areas I want to remain very bright. Now for this technique, these highlights are actually overly bright. So what I'm going to do is a technique called Glazing. I'm going to use Seraphim Sepia, but I'm going to water it down with about 50% water. And I'm not going to go over the entirety of the model with this, but I'm really just going to hit those heavy highlights and some of the mid-tone just to tone back the highlights a little bit. This is not a wash, so you don't want it pooling in the recesses or anything like that. As for the hair, I'm going to do several stages of highlights here. For most of the hair, I'm going back over with our Babe Blonde base tone. And then to start the highlights, I'm going to actually mix Babe Blonde with Flash Sketch Yellow. This is going to be a very bright yellow. Our next highlight will have 1 drop of ivory mixed into the mix. I'm going to be picking out a lot of the same areas, but just slightly smaller. And then I'm going to do a final highlight, mixing in ivory into our mix once again to get an even brighter tone. Now, to finish off the face area, I'm going to tackle the eyes and mouth. I'm using ivory to pick out the whites of the eyes. I'm trying to leave a small black border around the eyes, but don't worry too much about that. And then using German Grey, I'm going to pick out the pupils. I also went into her mouth to kind of poke out some teeth with our ivory. I went over the gold areas with our original base tone mix, but then mixed in just a slight bit of ivory to brighten that tone just a little bit. Now you will have noticed that on her left side of her cape, there was a really huge gap. I did not notice this gap before priming the miniature. Normally I would fill this with green stuff, which is a type of modeling clay which could be used to fill gaps like that, especially this really large. Now fortunately there's still a way to fix it. It is not quite as elegant as green stuff, but it will work. And I'm going to use matte varnish. This is basically a colorless substance. I'm poking it into the gap as much as possible. It looks gross now, but when it dries you will barely notice it at all. Now I'm going to be tackling the shield and her uniform. For the darker parts of her uniform and the shield emblem, I'm going to be mixing Averland Sunset with a smidge of ivory to start with. I'm going to start with the shield because I'm not going to go quite as crazy with the highlights as I will on the uniform. I'm going to use this largely just to pick out some areas, make it look a little bit more weathered and add some character to the shield. I'll then use the same color on the orange parts of her uniform, and I'm going to work basically bottom up. So I want the tips of her uniform to be sort of the brightest area. I'll do another coat, adding just a little bit more ivory to our mix. If you wish, you can add even more ivory to this mix and highlight everything once again. I'm going to tackle the other half of the uniform and the shield using Japanese World War II uniform, mixing in ivory in various stages. I'm going to do about 3 highlights, and for the shield, I'm really only picking out a few ridges and basically the outline of the shield here and there. I'm going to briefly jump to the backpack now. I'm really only doing 1 highlight here with Steel Legion Drab, and I'm picking out just a few edges to kind of highlight and make a little bit more prominent. For the shirt, I'm going to mix rust gray with a little bit of ivory in order to create a single highlight. I then decided to highlight the silver bits, so I'm picking out edges on her boots. For the sword behind her back, I'm picking out basically just the edges and sort of the bottom edge of the sword, the hilt, and the top of the guard. For the sword in her hand, I'm highlighting the very tip of the sword and also one of the edges. Then I went ahead and tackled the cape itself. For this, we're using our orange, brown, and ivory mix, but then mixing in just a little bit of ivory. For my highlights of the cape, I'm trying to keep them to the lower edge of the cape as much as possible. If the highlights on the cape seem a little overly bright to you, feel free to go back over them with a glaze of Averland Sunset. I then picked out the ropes on the back. Finally, to tackle the bedrolls themselves, I'm going to go over the middle roll itself with just our normal orange brown to start with. And then I will mix in a little bit of ivory into the orange brown, go over that very same area, but also the edges on sort of the top and around the sides. For her bedroll below the backpack, I'm going to start my highlight from the top and kind of fade it out downwards. If you want to highlight the twine on the bedrolls, I use Stormvermin Fur. It's a lighter gray color, but you could also just use German gray and mix in a little bit of ivory. And with that, the highlights are done. The figure is basically complete. Now I'm going to paint the base with Mechanica Standard Gray. Now I am going to do some optional final touches here. For the base itself, I'm mixing some white glue with some water to water it down a bit and smothering that all over the base. Then I'm going to take some black battleground from Army Painter and I'm just going to sprinkle that onto the base. I did this about 2 times to give a little bit more solid rock definition. Then to give the figure just a slight bit more character, I'm going to slightly copy the artwork here and give certain areas of her a slight purplish tone to them. For this, I'm mixing Drakenhof Nightshade, Durichi Violet, and a little bit of Lamian Medium. And this is to give a slight glow in certain areas of the figure. I'm going to use several layers of this on her boots, a little bit on the hair just in front, and several layers on the bottom lower half of the sword that she's holding. I'm using this glow a little bit on her left shoulder plate as well. Now I always put a nice spray of matte varnish onto the figure to protect it and so that everything stays put. And with that, the figure is now fully complete. I hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial for Vast. I'm really excited to paint a lot of the other figures. I think this is a really colorful and cool game. If you haven't checked it out, please do. There is also a Kickstarter running for the sequel/expansion, The Mysterious Manor. And once again, if you like this, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment below. Let me know what miniature you would like to see next, or tell me some things you would like to see or like me to explain more in depth in either another video or in a standalone video. I'm always around for comments and suggestions. I hope your painting journey goes well, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.